What started as a normal talk show interview quickly turned into one of the most uncomfortable moments on live television. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn, and a guest calmly decides to challenge the direction of the discussion in real time? Make sure to subscribe to Prime Voice, and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. The moment unfolded during what was supposed to be a fairly standard guest appearance by Idris Elba on a daytime talk show very similar in format and tone to The View. Idris had joined the panel to promote a new project, and the atmosphere at the start of the segment was exactly what viewers would expect. The hosts welcomed him warmly, the audience applauded as he walked out, and there was the usual brief exchange of compliments and light jokes before the conversation shifted into the main topics. At first, the discussion stayed focused on his career. One of the hosts asked about how he chooses roles, and Idris spoke calmly about balancing creative fulfillment with projects that reach a wide audience. His answers were measured, thoughtful, and clearly well-rehearsed in the sense that he had given similar interviews many times before. The panel nodded along, occasionally adding short comments about his past films and television work. Then the conversation gradually moved toward a broader topic, one that often comes up on daytime talk shows when male celebrities are guests. Joy Behar brought up the idea of representation in Hollywood, specifically focusing on how men in the industry handle conversations about diversity, inclusion, and social responsibility. Her tone was not aggressive at first. It was framed as a general question, and she asked Idris how he felt about the pressure placed on high-profile actors to speak out on social issues. Idris responded carefully, saying that he believed artists have a platform and that it can be used for good, but he also felt that not every moment in a creative career needs to be political. He explained that sometimes his goal is simply to tell stories that connect with people emotionally, regardless of the social context. The audience responded with light applause, and the other hosts seemed satisfied with the answer. Joy, however, followed up with another point. She suggested that staying neutral can sometimes be seen as avoiding responsibility, especially for someone with as much influence as Idris. She mentioned that audiences often look to celebrities to take strong public stances, particularly during times of social tension. Her phrasing was still calm, but it introduced a subtle pressure into the conversation. Idris paused for a moment before responding, and this was one of the first noticeable shifts in body language. He leaned slightly forward in his chair and spoke more slowly, choosing his words carefully. He said that while he understands the expectation, he does not agree that silence or neutrality automatically equals avoidance. He emphasized that people contribute to social progress in different ways, and that not every contribution has to be loud or public. The tone in the studio changed slightly at that point. The conversation was no longer just a promotional interview. It had become a real discussion about personal responsibility and public influence. One of the other hosts tried to lighten the mood by adding that everyone has their own style of activism, and that Idris has supported many causes privately. But Joy continued to press the issue. She pointed out that visibility itself is a form of power, and that choosing not to speak can sometimes send a message, whether intended or not. Her delivery was firm but not hostile. Still, the repeated questioning created a sense of tension that viewers could clearly feel through the screen. Idris remained composed, but his responses became more direct. He said that he sometimes feels boxed in by the assumption that his public identity must always align with specific expectations. He explained that being asked to constantly perform a certain role off-screen can feel limiting, and that he values the freedom to decide when and how he engages with social topics. This was the moment when the exchange subtly shifted from discussion to disagreement. Idris was no longer just answering questions. He was gently pushing back against the framing of the issue itself. He clarified that his approach is not about avoiding difficult conversations, but about having them in spaces where he feels they can be meaningful rather than symbolic. Joy responded by saying that public platforms are exactly where meaningful conversations should happen. She argued that millions of viewers watch these shows, and that messages delivered here can influence public opinion. Her tone remained calm, but the persistence in her argument made it clear that she disagreed with Idris's perspective. The studio audience reacted with a mix of applause and quiet murmurs, which is often a sign that people are divided. Some clapped at Joy's points, while others nodded when Idris spoke. The camera occasionally cut to the other hosts, who appeared attentive but cautious, clearly aware that the segment was becoming more serious than originally planned. Idris then made one of his most pointed remarks of the segment. He said that he respects the power of media platforms, but he does not believe in being pressured into statements that feel performative. He explained that authenticity matters more to him than visibility, and that he would rather contribute in ways that align with his personal values instead of public expectations. There was a noticeable pause after he said this. Joy looked thoughtful but not convinced. She replied that authenticity and visibility are not mutually exclusive, and that sometimes the act of speaking publicly can inspire others, even if it feels uncomfortable. Her tone suggested she was trying to broaden the conversation rather than challenge Idris personally, but the disagreement was now clearly established. The pacing of the conversation slowed down at this point. Both sides were speaking more carefully, and interruptions became less frequent. It felt like a moment where everyone on set understood that this was no longer just entertainment. It was a genuine exchange of perspectives happening live. One of the co-hosts attempted to shift the focus slightly by asking Idris how he personally decides when to speak out on issues. This allowed him to explain his process without directly responding to Joy's argument. He said that he listens, reflects, and chooses moments that feel sincere rather than reactive. He also mentioned that social media pressure can sometimes create unrealistic expectations for constant engagement. Joy acknowledged his point, but added that audiences often interpret silence differently than intended. She said that viewers may not see the private work or the personal reflections, and that what they experience is only what happens publicly. This, she argued, is why public voices carry so much weight. The exchange remained respectful, but the underlying tension was clear. Idris was pushing back against the idea that his public role should dictate his personal behavior, while Joy was advocating for the importance of visible leadership from influential figures. Neither raised their voice, and there were no dramatic gestures, but the disagreement felt real and unscripted. From an audience perspective, this was one of those moments that feels slightly uncomfortable but also engaging. Viewers could sense that the conversation had gone beyond the planned topics, and that both sides were speaking honestly rather than following a prepared narrative. The host's body language reflected this, with more serious expressions and fewer smiles than earlier in the segment. As the first part of the segment continued, the discussion settled into a quieter rhythm. Idris reiterated that he values dialogue but resists being defined by external expectations. Joy maintained that influence comes with responsibility, and that public figures inevitably shape conversations whether they intend to or not. The disagreement did not explode into anything dramatic, but it also did not resolve neatly. It lingered in the air, creating a thoughtful but tense atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the lighthearted tone at the start of the interview. For viewers, it was clear that this was one of those live television moments where the line between guest and panelist blurred, and the conversation became something more personal and complex than originally planned. The conversation continued without a commercial break, and that in itself made the moment feel more intense than usual. On most daytime talk shows, serious topics are often separated by lighter segments or brief pauses. But here the discussion flowed straight through, which meant the tension from the earlier exchange carried over naturally. Idris remained seated in the same relaxed posture, but his facial expression was noticeably more focused than when he first walked out onto the set. Joy, on the other hand, leaned slightly toward the table, her hands resting near her notes, clearly prepared to continue the topic. One of the co-hosts tried to bring the conversation back to Idris's current project by asking how the themes of the film connected to real-world issues. This question worked as a bridge between promotion and the ongoing discussion, and Idris took the opportunity to explain that the story touched on identity, belonging, and personal choice. He described how those themes resonate with audiences because they reflect everyday struggles rather than abstract debates. Joy picked up on the word identity and used it to steer the conversation back toward representation. She asked Idris whether he felt that Hollywood had genuinely improved in creating opportunities for diverse voices, or whether progress was mostly superficial. Her tone was still conversational, but the subject matter naturally pulled the discussion back into more serious territory. Idris answered by acknowledging that there has been improvement, but he also pointed out that change is slow and uneven. He said that while there are more opportunities than there were earlier in his career, systemic issues still exist behind the scenes. He spoke calmly, using specific examples from his own experiences without naming individuals or studios, which kept the conversation grounded and professional. Joy responded by saying that this is exactly why she believes public pressure matters. She argued that without visible voices calling out these issues, industries often move at their own pace, which can be frustrating for people waiting for change. Her delivery was firm but not confrontational, and she framed her point as a broader observation rather than a critique of Idris personally. Idris nodded as she spoke, which suggested he was listening carefully. When he replied, he clarified that he does not oppose public pressure, but he questions the assumption that it must always come from celebrities. He said that activists, workers within the industry, and community leaders often drive change more effectively than famous individuals. In his view, focusing too much on celebrity voices can sometimes overshadow the efforts of people doing the actual work on the ground. This was another subtle moment of pushback. Idris was not rejecting Joy's argument outright, but he was reframing it in a way that shifted attention away from himself. The audience responded with scattered applause, and the camera briefly showed a few audience members nodding, which indicated that his point resonated with at least part of the crowd. Joy replied by saying that while grassroots efforts are essential, celebrity involvement can amplify those voices. She explained that media attention often follows famous names, and that this attention can bring resources and awareness to causes that might otherwise remain unnoticed. Her tone suggested that she saw celebrity activism as a tool rather than a replacement for deeper work. The pacing of the exchange became more measured at this point. Both sides were clearly trying to avoid talking over each other, and the interruptions that are common on panel shows were noticeably reduced. The hosts seemed aware that this was a sensitive topic, and they allowed longer pauses between responses, which made the segment feel more like a real conversation than a typical television debate. One of the other co-hosts attempted to balance the discussion by pointing out that Idris has supported various initiatives in the past, even if he does not always speak about them publicly. She mentioned a few general examples, such as charity work and advocacy campaigns, without going into too much detail. This seemed to ease the tension slightly, as it acknowledged Idris's contributions without forcing him into a defensive position. Idris thanked her for the comment and said that he prefers to keep some of his involvement private because he does not want his actions to feel like self-promotion. He explained that for him, helping others should not always be tied to public recognition. This statement was delivered calmly, but it clearly reinforced his earlier stance about authenticity and visibility. Joy listened and then responded by saying that while she respects that perspective, she believes that public recognition can sometimes inspire others to get involved. She argued that seeing well-known figures participate in social causes can motivate viewers to take action themselves. Her point was framed as a general observation about media influence rather than a direct challenge. The studio audience reacted again with a mix of applause and quiet murmurs. Some people clapped at Joy's point, while others seemed more aligned with Idris's emphasis on privacy. The divided reaction created a sense that the conversation reflected a broader public debate, not just a disagreement between two individuals on a talk show. From a viewer's standpoint, the body language was especially telling. Idris maintained steady eye contact with Joy, which conveyed respect and engagement, but his tone remained firm. Joy, meanwhile, kept her gestures minimal, using small hand movements to emphasize her points without becoming animated. The overall atmosphere was serious but controlled, with neither side showing signs of frustration or anger. As the discussion continued, the co-hosts occasionally interjected with short comments that summarized or reframed what had been said. These interventions helped keep the conversation accessible for viewers who might be joining mid-segment or who were less familiar with the broader context. At the same time, they prevented the exchange from becoming too narrow or personal. Idris made another important point by saying that he worries about the pressure placed on public figures to respond immediately to every major event. He explained that this expectation can lead to rushed statements that lack nuance or understanding. In his view, taking time to reflect before speaking can lead to more meaningful contributions. Joy acknowledged that this is a valid concern, but she added that in fast-moving news cycles, delays can sometimes be interpreted as indifference. She said that audiences often expect timely reactions, especially from people they admire. Her comment highlighted the tension between thoughtfulness and responsiveness, which is a common challenge in modern media. The conversation at this stage felt less like a disagreement and more like a philosophical exchange. Both sides were presenting reasonable arguments, and neither was trying to dominate the discussion. However, the underlying pushback remained clear. Idris was resisting the idea that his public role should dictate his behavior, while Joy continued to emphasize the influence that comes with fame. One of the hosts finally suggested that this topic could easily fill an entire segment on its own, which prompted light laughter from the audience. This moment of humor briefly eased the tension and reminded viewers that they were still watching a daytime talk show, even if the conversation had become unusually deep. Idris smiled and agreed, saying that these are complex issues with no simple answers. Joy also smiled, and for a moment the exchange felt less tense and more reflective. However, the disagreement was not fully resolved. Instead, it settled into a respectful difference of opinion that lingered beneath the surface. As part 2 of the segment came to a close, the conversation had clearly shifted the tone of the entire appearance. What began as a promotional interview had evolved into a thoughtful discussion about celebrity influence, authenticity, and social responsibility. For viewers watching live, it felt like one of those rare moments when a talk show unexpectedly becomes a space for genuine debate without losing its calm and professional atmosphere. As the segment moved forward, there was a brief shift in energy that often happens when a talk show tries to recalibrate after a serious exchange. One of the hosts attempted to lighten the mood by referencing a humorous moment from Idris's career, and the audience responded with laughter. This created a short pause in the intensity, allowing both Idris and Joy to relax slightly in their seats. However, the underlying topic had already been established, and it was clear that the conversation was not finished. After the laughter faded, the host gently steered the discussion back toward Idris's experiences in the industry, this time focusing on how public expectations have changed over the years. She asked whether he felt more pressure now than earlier in his career to speak on social and political topics. This question brought the conversation back into familiar territory without directly repeating the earlier disagreement. Idris took a moment before answering, which suggested he was choosing his words carefully. He said that early in his career, he felt more focused on proving himself as an actor and less concerned with public commentary. Over time, as his profile grew, he noticed that people began to expect opinions from him on a wide range of issues, not just those related to his work. He described this shift as gradual but significant. Joy listened closely and then commented that this is a common experience for many public figures. She said that once someone reaches a certain level of visibility, their silence or presence on issues becomes part of how they are perceived, whether they want it to or not. Her tone was less argumentative than earlier, more observational, which slightly softened the exchange. Idris agreed with her observation, but added that perception does not always reflect intention. He explained that just because someone is not speaking publicly does not mean they are disengaged or indifferent. He said that people often forget that celebrities are individuals with personal boundaries, and that constant exposure can make it difficult to maintain a sense of privacy. This point seemed to resonate with the audience, as there was a noticeable round of applause. The camera briefly cut to several audience members who appeared thoughtful rather than excited, which suggested that the discussion was prompting reflection rather than entertainment. Joy responded by saying that she understands the desire for privacy, but she believes that the nature of fame changes the relationship between public figures and audiences. She argued that visibility creates a kind of shared space, where viewers feel invested in not just the work, but also the values of the people they admire. Her tone remained calm, but the point reinforced her earlier stance. At this stage, the disagreement had evolved into a more nuanced conversation. Instead of directly opposing each other, Idris and Joy were exploring different aspects of the same issue. The tension was still present, but it felt more intellectual than personal. One of the co-hosts added that social media has intensified this dynamic. She said that in the past, celebrities could choose when to speak through controlled interviews or statements, but now audiences expect immediate reactions through platforms like Twitter or Instagram. This comment shifted the focus slightly, allowing Idris to expand on his earlier point about pressure. Idris said that social media has changed everything. He explained that the constant flow of information makes it difficult to keep up with expectations, and that public figures are often criticized whether they speak or stay silent. He described this as a no-win situation, where any response can be interpreted in multiple ways. Joy acknowledged this and said that social media also creates opportunities for direct engagement with fans. She argued that while it can be overwhelming, it also allows celebrities to communicate without filters or intermediaries. Her comment suggested that she sees digital platforms as both a challenge and a tool. The audience reacted with light laughter when Idris said that sometimes he misses the days when interviews were limited to television and print. This moment of humor briefly eased the seriousness of the conversation and reminded viewers of the generational differences in how media is experienced. As the discussion continued, Idris made a point about being selective with his public statements. He said that he prefers to speak when he feels he has something meaningful to add, rather than commenting simply because he is expected to. He emphasized that this approach helps him maintain a sense of integrity and avoid being reactive. Joy replied by saying that she respects that approach, but she still believes that silence can sometimes be misinterpreted. She noted that in times of crisis or social unrest, people often look to familiar faces for reassurance or guidance. Her tone was empathetic rather than critical, which marked a shift from the earlier pushback. The co-hosts nodded along, and one of them summarized the exchange by saying that the issue seems to be about balance. She suggested that public figures need to find a way to remain authentic while also acknowledging the influence they hold. This framing helped bring the conversation into a more neutral space. Idris agreed with this summary and said that balance is exactly what he tries to achieve. He explained that he does not want to be completely detached from social conversations, but he also does not want to feel obligated to perform a role that does not align with who he is. His tone was calm and reflective, and there was no sign of defensiveness. Joy smiled and said that she appreciates his honesty. She added that these kinds of conversations are important because they reveal how complex public expectations can be. Her comment felt more like a closing thought than a challenge, which further reduced the tension. The studio audience responded with a longer round of applause, indicating that the segment had reached a moment of mutual understanding, even if not complete agreement. The camera showed Idris and Joy exchanging brief smiles, which suggested that the disagreement had settled into a respectful difference of opinion. From a viewer's perspective, this part of the segment felt like a turning point. The initial pushback had evolved into a thoughtful discussion, and both sides appeared more relaxed. The body language was less rigid, and the pacing of the conversation became more natural again. However, the topic had clearly left an impression. The show had shifted from light entertainment to a more reflective tone, and even as the hosts prepared to transition to the next subject, the themes of influence, responsibility, and authenticity lingered in the background. As Part 3 came to an end, it was clear that the exchange between Idris and Joy had become one of the defining moments of the episode. It was not dramatic or confrontational, but it was genuine and unscripted, offering viewers a rare glimpse into how public figures navigate expectations in real time on live television. As the show moved into the later portion of the segment, there was a noticeable attempt by the hosts to gently guide the conversation back toward a more traditional talk show rhythm. The energy in the studio had settled, but it had not returned to the light, promotional tone from the beginning. Instead, it carried a quieter seriousness, the kind that often follows an honest on-air exchange. Idris remained composed, sitting back slightly in his chair, while Joy glanced down at her notes before looking back up at him, signaling that the conversation was shifting but not entirely moving on. One of the co-hosts introduced a new angle by asking Idris how he personally handles public criticism, especially when opinions about his silence or his statements circulate online. The question felt like a natural continuation of what had already been discussed, and it allowed Idris to speak from personal experience rather than general principles. Idris responded by saying that criticism is something he has learned to live with over time. He explained that early in his career, negative comments or misunderstandings affected him more deeply, but with experience, he has become better at filtering what deserves his attention. He said that he listens to thoughtful criticism, but tries not to be consumed by noise or assumptions made without context. Joy nodded as he spoke and added that public criticism has intensified for everyone in the age of social media. She said that the speed at which opinions spread can be overwhelming, and that even well-intentioned comments can be taken out of context. Her tone was reflective, and for the first time in the segment, she seemed to be speaking from a place of shared experience rather than debate. Idris agreed and said that this environment is part of why he chooses his moments carefully. He explained that once a statement is made publicly, it can take on a life of its own, often detached from the original intent. He described this as one of the challenges of being both visible and human at the same time. The audience responded with quiet applause, and the camera briefly captured a few thoughtful expressions among the panel. The exchange felt less tense and more contemplative, as if the disagreement had opened the door to a broader conversation about media culture rather than a narrow clash of viewpoints. One of the hosts then asked Idris how he maintains a sense of balance between his public role and his private life. This question further softened the tone and allowed the conversation to move towards something more personal. Idris said that setting boundaries is essential, and that he has learned to protect certain parts of his life from constant scrutiny. Joy responded by saying that boundaries are important, but she also pointed out that audiences often feel a sense of familiarity with public figures. She explained that viewers watch these shows regularly and develop a connection that feels personal, even if it is one-sided. Her comment was delivered calmly, without the earlier insistence that had defined her pushback. Idris acknowledged this and said that he appreciates the support and interest from audiences. He clarified that his pushback earlier in the segment was not about rejecting that connection, but about preserving his ability to engage honestly. He said that when expectations become too rigid, they can undermine genuine dialogue. This clarification seemed to ease any remaining tension. Joy responded by saying that she understood his perspective more clearly after hearing him explain it in that way. She admitted that talk show conversations sometimes compress complex issues into short exchanges, which can make disagreements feel sharper than they really are. The studio audience reacted with light laughter and applause at this remark, recognizing the truth in it. The atmosphere on set felt noticeably calmer, and the hosts appeared more relaxed as they prepared to transition toward the end of the segment. One of the co-hosts summarized the discussion by saying that it highlighted how complicated the relationship between celebrities, audiences, and media has become. She noted that there are no simple rules for when or how public figures should speak, and that each person has to navigate those expectations in their own way. Idris agreed with this summary and said that he hopes conversations like this can encourage more understanding on all sides. He emphasized that disagreement does not have to be hostile, and that respectful dialogue can exist even when people see things differently. Joy smiled and said that she appreciates being able to have these conversations on live television, even when they are uncomfortable. She added that moments like this are part of what makes daytime talk shows relevant, because they reflect real debates happening in society. The audience responded with a warm round of applause, and the camera briefly showed Idris and Joy exchanging a polite nod. The body language suggested mutual respect rather than lingering conflict. The earlier pushback had evolved into a clearer understanding of each other's positions. As the segment approached its final minutes, the hosts thanked Idris for his openness and for engaging in the discussions so thoughtfully. He thanked them in return and said that he values spaces where conversations can unfold naturally rather than being reduced to sound bites. From a viewer's perspective, this part of the episode felt like a resolution, not in the sense that everyone agreed, but in the sense that the tension had been addressed rather than avoided. The disagreement had been handled calmly and professionally, without raising voices or resorting to personal remarks. As Part 4 came to a close, it was clear that the exchange had added depth to the episode. What began as a routine appearance had turned into a meaningful discussion about influence, responsibility, and authenticity, all unfolding live in a way that felt genuine and reflective of real daytime television conversations. As the segment moved into its final moments, the hosts began to wrap up the conversation in the familiar way daytime talk shows often do, by gently summarizing what had been discussed and transitioning toward closing remarks. The overall energy in the studio was noticeably calmer than it had been earlier. The tension that marked the middle of the exchange had softened into something more reflective, and both Idris and Joy appeared more relaxed in their posture. One of the co-hosts thanked Idris again for joining the show and for being open about his views. She mentioned that it was refreshing to see a guest engage in a real conversation rather than simply delivering rehearsed answers. Idris smiled and said that he appreciated being given the space to explain his perspective, even when it did not perfectly align with everyone else at the table. Joy added that this kind of dialogue is part of what makes live television unpredictable in a good way. She said that while the segment did not go exactly as planned, it turned into something meaningful and relevant for viewers. Her tone was warm, and there was no trace of the firmness that had characterized her earlier pushback. Idris responded by saying that he values respectful disagreement and that he believes conversations like this help people understand different viewpoints without turning them into conflicts. He emphasized that the exchange was never about winning an argument, but about exploring how public expectations and personal values intersect. The studio audience responded with sustained applause, longer than at any other point in the segment. This reaction felt less like excitement and more like appreciation, as if viewers in the room recognized that they had just witnessed a genuine moment of discussion rather than a typical talk show routine. As the hosts prepared to cut to a commercial break, one of them joked lightly that this might be one of the deepest conversations they had all week. The audience laughed, and Idris laughed along, which helped bring the tone back to something more familiar and relaxed. Before the segment officially ended, Joy offered a brief closing comment, saying that while she and Idris may not see everything the same way, she appreciated his honesty and willingness to engage. Idris thanked her in return and said that he respects her perspective, even when he approaches things differently. The camera pulled back slightly to show the full panel, all smiling and exchanging polite nods. From a viewer's standpoint, it was clear that the disagreement had not damaged the atmosphere of the show. Instead, it had added a layer of depth that made the episode more memorable than a standard celebrity interview. When the show went to break, the studio audience continued clapping for a few seconds, which is often a sign that a segment resonated. There were no awkward silences or visible discomfort. The mood felt settled, thoughtful, and professional. After the episode aired, reactions began appearing online almost immediately. Viewers on social media discussed the exchange in a largely balanced way. Some agreed with Joy's argument that public figures have a responsibility to speak out more openly, especially during important social moments. Others supported Idris's stance, saying that celebrities should not be pressured into making public statements simply because of their fame. Many comments focused on how calm and respectful the disagreement had been. Viewers noted that it was refreshing to see a serious topic discussed without shouting or personal attacks. Several people praised both Idris and Joy for maintaining a composed tone and actually listening to each other's points. Short clips of the exchange circulated across platforms, with captions highlighting different moments depending on the perspective of the person sharing them. Some clips emphasized Joy's point about visibility and influence, while others focused on Idris's remarks about authenticity and personal boundaries. The fact that different parts of the conversation resonated with different audiences reflected how evenly balanced the discussion had been. A few entertainment news outlets also referenced the moment, describing it as a thoughtful on-air exchange rather than a confrontation. Headlines used phrases like calm debate and respectful disagreement, which reinforced the idea that the segment stood out not because of drama, but because of its realism. In follow-up interviews and discussions, neither Idris nor Joy framed the moment as a conflict. Idris mentioned in a later appearance that he appreciated the opportunity to talk openly about issues that are often oversimplified. Joy, in a separate conversation, said that she enjoys when guests challenge ideas respectfully, because it keeps the show dynamic and honest. From a broader perspective, the segment became an example of how live talk shows can still create meaningful moments without relying on controversy or exaggerated conflict. It showed how disagreement can exist in a calm, constructive way, reflecting the kinds of conversations many people have in their own lives. For viewers, the lasting impression was not that Idris won or that Joy lost, but that both presented valid perspectives on a complex topic. The exchange felt unscripted, human, and grounded in real experiences, which is why it stayed in people's minds longer than a typical promotional interview. In the end, the segment closed exactly as daytime television often does, with polite smiles, applause, and a smooth transition into the next part of the show. But what made it memorable was the authenticity of the discussion, and the way it unfolded naturally in front of a live audience. It was a reminder that even within the familiar format of a talk show, real conversations can still happen, and that respectful disagreement can be just as engaging as agreement when handled thoughtfully. Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Prime Voice for more narration-based talk show stories.